Welcome in everybody to another edition of my roster review series with a look into the 2022 Montreal Alouettes, a team that I find very interesting going into this season. But really quickly before we get to all of that, if you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting the like button and subscribing to Husky Huddle for more CFL content just like this. I greatly appreciate it, everybody. And with that said, let's talk about the Montreal Alouettes, starting with today's agenda. And first of all, we're going to go into their 2021 recap, what happened to them last season, then going into their coaching staff that they're going to be bringing into this season. And then the bulk of the video is going to be our 2022 positional rankings, where we see every position on this team, where it stacks up relative to the rest of the CFL. And then we're going to go into the starting lineups, trying to piece together where this team is going to be slotting in its players this season. And then finally, we're going to go into the team award predictions and a key storyline to watch out for this team this season. And without further ado, let's go on to the 2021 recap. And the Alouettes had a very interesting season last year, which I thought they played much better than their record showed. I thought they had a couple of really tight losses. Thinking about that game that they had early in the season against Calgary, that's one they definitely should have had. The last game of the season against Ottawa in the regular season, should have had that one. And really the numbers bear this out. They finished first in total offense and finished first in sacks and interceptions. Really rare numbers for a team that ultimately only finished 500 in the CFL. And despite this, they were able to make the playoffs as the third seed in the East, but they lost to Hamilton in the East semifinal, and this was the second consecutive year that they lost in the East semifinal, so they're going to be looking to get over that playoff hump this season. Now, speaking about the guys that are going to try to help them get over this hump, with the 2022 coaching staff led by head coach Khari Jones, a former CFL quarterback himself, who has been on the job here for a couple of years now and has brought life back into this organization. He's a very well-liked guy that has a lot of charisma, but I do think this team has its flaws from a coaching perspective. It had a lot of discipline issues, a lot of bad penalties. I think they were last in the CFL last season in terms of penalties taken. So you're going to have to watch out for that, but he's a very smart offensive-minded guy. And speaking of which, he also holds the offensive coordinator duties for this team. A lot of guys in the CFL head coaches, they double up in those roles that they're specialized in. And then he's joined by defensive coordinator Baron Miles, a lot of experience from playing in the CFL, but a relatively new defensive coordinator. I thought success-wise, he was pretty good last season. You know, obviously, first in sacks, first in interceptions. He's going to try to create turnovers, and I think that is exactly what they were able to do last season. And then finally, special teams coordinator Byron Archambault. Don't know too much about him. I forget if he was the guy that filled in for Khari Jones last season when he had to miss a game, I think due to COVID protocols. So, I mean, really interesting staff here for the Alouettes, and I think it's more of a younger staff, especially with Baron Miles and Khari Jones, and we'll see if they can get them over the hump this year. Now let's go into our first positional rankings with the quarterbacks, which is going to come in at third in the CFL, and I just like that they have two veteran experienced quarterbacks here, especially in a CFL 18-game season, which we didn't have last year. You're going to see quarterback injuries, and the teams that are best equipped to deal with those injuries are the teams that are going to be left standing or in good position near the end of the season. And I think Montreal is in a good position to do so with who they have here. And we'll start with Vernon Adams Jr., who's an athletic quarterback with a strong arm. And what really separates him from other CFL quarterbacks is his play extension ability and his ability to improvise. In my opinion, he arguably has the highest ceiling of any CFL quarterback in the league right now. But the problem I see with him is largely the mental side of the game, often not going through his progressions and opting for higher risk throws. Like sometimes he just doesn't take the easy stuff underneath when he really should and, you know, progress the drive and get the first downs. So that's a big problem I see with Adams' game, and I think accuracy sometimes can be an issue as well on those throws over the middle. He's a little bit of a shorter quarterback. Sometimes that can bother a shorter quarterback trying to throw over the larger offensive linemen. So ultimately, I think Adams has so much potential, and I think, like I said, I believe he has the highest ceiling of any quarterback in the CFL due to that excellent improvisational ability, strong arm. He just makes throws that I haven't seen other CFL quarterbacks make. And then the Alouettes bring back veteran quarterback Trevor Harris, who started for this team in the playoffs last year when Vernon Adams got injured. He's a pure pocket passer that excels when given a clean pocket, but struggles when forced to move off of his spot when he's pressured. When at his best, he is a great rhythm thrower that can get hot in a hurry. For example, play-action passes to the boundary are often some of his most proficient plays. However, what's interesting with Harris is that he's kind of the opposite of Adams in a way, in that he's not very good when forced to go off script. So it's really interesting that he's the backup here, but he did play well, relatively speaking, for the Alouettes near the end of last season. Obviously had a lot of turnovers in that playoff game against Hamilton, but I thought they moved the ball really well with him at the helm, and I would feel confident in him if he was pressed into action here. And then Dominic Davis, a very athletic type quarterback that has shown major accuracy and decision-making flaws during his past 2 seasons. He's seen a lot of starts over the last couple of years in Ottawa, but he just hasn't really put anything together on a consistent basis. In my opinion, Davis's best plays really come when he's ad-libbing or improvising and just going off script, similar to Vernon Adams. And then let's go on to these 2 rookies here at the bottom here. Ben Holmes, who was actually the 4th overall pick in the USFL draft by the New Jersey Generals, but suffered an injury and was released shortly thereafter. Prior to the USFL, he had experience in the Indoor Football League. And then Davis Alexander, a former standout at Portland State, and we'll see if he can make the roster or stay around on a practice roster capacity here. So overall, very confident in this quarterback room going into this season, given the 2 experienced starters. Now flipping over to the running back position, which is going to finish first in the CFL, and this is all about William Stanback, who, in my opinion, is easily the best running back in the CFL going into this season, and arguably the best player in the entire league, if we're being honest, from 2021. He's a workhorse running back that possesses a rare combination of power, agility, and breakaway speed. Stanback consistently breaks tackles and creates big plays. Not the best receiver out of the backfield, but you shouldn't ask him to be. This is the CFL version of Adrian Peterson in his prime. Just hand him the rock 15 to 20 times a game and let him go to work. And then Canadian running back Jeshwin Antwi, a young running back out of the University of Calgary who shows capable speed and athleticism in his limited opportunities so far in his young career. However, one thing that showed up last year were fumbling issues, which is something he'll need to correct if he is to earn a consistent role going forward. Cameron Artis-Payne, a capable backup who filled in for Stanback on a couple of occasions last season. He is a longtime pro football veteran that is entering his 2nd CFL season in 2022. However, when I was putting together this video, I realized he was added to the suspended list at the beginning of training camp, so who knows what's going on with him or if he will even play this season. And then they bring in DeLance Turner from Ottawa, who is a former Baltimore Raven and joined Ottawa midway through last season and had some solid production in a few starts that he had there. He was released by Ottawa a few weeks ago, but was quickly brought in here by Montreal, and maybe he's just kind of Cameron Artis-Payne insurance here in case he doesn't play this season. And then these last guys here are mostly just special teams contributors, starting with Alexander Gagne, a career special teamer who consistently ranks year after year among the league's leaders in special teams tackles. Regis Sabasu, another special teamer who hasn't received opportunities in other capacities his first 2 seasons, so not really a role on offense for him. Christopher Norman, a longtime fullback who is mostly a contributor on special teams, like I said. He has also seen occasional action on defense in his career, so, kind of just a versatile guy that hasn't seen too much action on offense or defense throughout the years. And then Taku Lee, the global here, who's from Japan and had a few opportunities on kick returns last season, but not much else. He was the 3rd round pick of the Alouettes in the 2021 global draft. So overall, the reason why this team ranks first is quite simply just because of William Stanback just being the dominant force that he is at the CFL level, and I'm really excited to watch him once again this season. Now in terms of running back rookies, they have a couple guys here after a few guys were added to the suspension list at the beginning of training camp. Reith John Gerard, a mid-round pick in this year's CFL draft out of Montreal, who brings special teams potential to the table, also looked pretty good in terms of his pass protection ability at the CFL Combine. And then Tavian Feaster, a two-time national champion while at Clemson. He was on the Arizona Cardinals roster at times in 2021. So we'll see if either of these guys really factor in this year. Now let's move on to the wide receivers, which are going to come in at 4th in the CFL. And I think you have two superstar receivers, just inarguable what they were able to do last season, that you don't consider them a superstar receiver at this point. But I think there's depth issues behind them, and let's talk about them. So Eugene Lewis, who's a dynamic athlete at the wide receiver position, capable of winning in all areas of the field. He primarily lines up as an outside boundary side receiver and consistently wins contested catches on a weekly basis. Lewis's long frame combined with his quickness allows for him to have an edge versus defensive backs in almost any matchup. He's decent enough at generating yards after the catch, but I wouldn't call that a strength of his. And he's been known to drop some easy passes in the past, but overall just a superstar wideout and one of the best receivers in the entire CFL. And then Jake Weineke, another breakout guy, a smooth all-around receiver that has a big frame and runs good routes. He has consistent hands that allow him to be a reliable source of offense. Weineke has done much of his damage in the red zone through his 2-year CFL career, scoring 19 touchdowns in 32 career games, so quite a rate there. And then behind those two guys, you got the questions, right? So Reggie White, a player that emerged down the stretch last season as one of the team's better receivers. White has a good mix of size and speed, which should give the offense an option over the middle on crossing routes. In my estimation, he's a breakout candidate to fill Montreal's 3rd wide receiver role. And then Quan Bray, a very athletic receiver capable of creating big plays, but has also made consistent crucial mistakes in his CFL career. Drops have been a thing that have been common, and offside penalties have shown up as well. But still, he has the potential to boom or bust going into 2022. I really just don't know what to expect from him. He's a very inconsistent player. And then you got a couple Canadian guys here, starting with Hergy Mayala, a 3rd-year receiver who had an excellent rookie season in 2019 with Calgary, but took a step backwards in 2021. Mayala has the athleticism to be a high-end receiver in this league, as he showed late in a stretch during his rookie season, and is best utilized running the waggle, as he doesn't have the fastest get-off at the snap, not the fastest starter in terms of his routes. Much of his disappointing 2021 season may have resulted from him being used as the field side wide receiver in most sets in Calgary's offense, but ultimately just a very down season from him. Really didn't create anything after the catch, just very basic catches on check down routes and whatnot. Just not a very productive season from him last year, but I think he's definitely a candidate for a bounce back given what potential he showed as a rookie. And then competing with him, Keon Julian Grant, a speedster that started the majority of games with Montreal last season at the field side wide receiver position. He wasn't all too productive last season, so I definitely think his job in the starting lineup is definitely, up for grabs with Mayala coming into camp here. And then Dante Absher, who has been with the Alouettes the past 2 seasons and has shown flashes in limited opportunities. He should have the opportunity to compete for a full-time starting spot this season with guys like Bray and Reggie White. And then Mario Alford, mostly a kick return specialist and an excellent one at that. He has unfortunately battled injuries over the last 2 seasons, I believe 2 season-ending injuries in a row, so hopefully he can stay healthy this season. And then Kevin Kea, a global receiver from France who played at the University of Montreal. He played in 1 game in 2021, so we don't know too much about him yet. But now let's look at the wide receiver rookies, and a couple interesting names here, starting with Tyson Philpott, who was this team's 1st-round pick, 9th overall in the CFL draft this season. Him and his brother were seen as guys that were very pro-ready, so it'll be interesting to see if he finds a way into the starting lineup with guys like Mayala and Keon Julian Grant this season. Ante Aguavin, an undrafted receiver who had a productive 2021 season after returning to Laurier for a 5th season. And then Krishan Hogan, originally an undrafted receiver in the NFL draft out of Marian University, which I've never heard of. He has had several stops on NFL practice squads the past several seasons. In total, he has 10 games of NFL experience, but none since 2019. Fabian Guerrera, who was previously under contract with Montreal in 2021, but never appeared in a game. He played college football for Fairmount State and most recently played in the Spring League. Matthew Robitaille, who attended last year's training camp but decided to return to Laval for a final season. Warren Newman, a former standout at Jackson State, which is now coached by Deion Sanders. Cole Speaker, a former Division III star at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And then finally, Craig Rucker, a very small receiver at 5'7", 160 pounds. We've seen players of his stature succeed at the CFL before. I think guys like Brandon Banks and whatnot. So we'll see if they found a diamond in the rough here with Rucker. But ultimately, I think it's an interesting group of rookies that could see some contributors this season, given Montreal's lack of wide receiver depth. Now going to the trenches with the offensive line, which is going to come in at 7th in the CFL. But what I will say is, if there's any offensive line that will outperform this ranking, I think it could be this one, given how well they played last year. I think this team, when they looked at it on paper going into last year, I thought this was a really weak unit, but I thought they played better than the sum of their parts. And let's start talking about them, starting with Sean Jamieson, a very well-rounded starting caliber center that doesn't really show any glaring weaknesses. He's not the most high upside lineman in my opinion, but he can execute many concepts at a starting level, and you're very comfortable with him at that spot. Christian Matt, a veteran starter on the interior who is capable of playing both guard and center. In general, his play has been consistent the past couple of seasons, including being nominated as this team's best lineman in 2019. He is arguably this unit's top run blocker in my opinion. Philippe Gagnon, a veteran guard who played at a replacement level when he was on the field last season. The volume of pressures that he gave up in pass protection wasn't extremely alarming, but the times that Gagnon did surrender pressure, he was often beaten badly by opposing defensive tackles, so we'll see if that props up again last season. I thought he was probably their worst starter along that offensive line. And then Landon Rice, a longtime CFL veteran who had perhaps his best CFL season in 2021, becoming a full-time starter at right tackle. While Rice's play there was certainly the best of his career, he did still have games where he would struggle to a significant extent, giving up a lot of pressures. For that reason, I don't think he has the week-to-week floor that some other tackles around the league do, so I don't think he's one of the better tackles in the league ultimately, but he does bring a lot of experience to the table. And then Chris Schluger, an off and on starter the past couple of seasons for the Alouettes. Schluger has been inconsistent to say the least, especially going back to his 2019 film, but he will likely have the inside track to start at left tackle this season after the departure of Tony Washington. And then after those 5 guys, you have a lot of guys that haven't seen a ton of starting experience. So we'll start with David Brown, a young developing offensive lineman who had some opportunities to see live reps last season along the interior. He is probably their most promising young lineman on the roster, though he is already 27 years old. Kwabena Asare, a former Carleton Raven who was selected way back in the 6th round of the 2017 CFL draft. He did not play in the CFL in 2021. Nick Callender, who played in a handful of games down the stretch last season and started a couple. Patrick Davis, a second-year lineman out of Syracuse who was selected in the 4th round in 2021. Taylor Tappan, who played for the Red Blacks and Alouettes last season as a rookie. And then finally, Samuel Thomason, who's a huge body at 6'6", 330 pounds. He appeared in 2 games in his first CFL season last year. So overall, like I said, I think it could outperform this ranking of 7th because I think this unit in general has great chemistry and they played really well together last year, but ultimately I just don't think there's very much upside with a lot of these veterans that they have starting here. Now taking a look at the offensive line rookies, and we'll start with the 2 guys that they drafted this year in the CFL draft, Rodeem Brown and Peter Kazushka, both out of the University of Alberta. Rodeem Brown, a very impressive guy in the pre-draft process. He ultimately goes in the 2nd round. Ultimately, I think it's because there was rumors that he was going to go back to school. He may just go to training camp here and decide to go back to school, but good to see him in camp here, and I think he has the potential to be the best offensive lineman in this draft class. I think he has just really great technique and is a future starter at center. And then Peter Kazushka, who's a very well-regarded guy in the early draft process. He was consistently in the top 20 Scouting Bureau rankings, but I think his testing and performance at the combine is really what dropped him all the way to the 5th round in this year's draft. So we'll see if he contributes here. And then Clayton Bradley, who played his college football at UNLV. Mark Brooks, a bigger tackle at 6'6", who looks to add competition to those tackle spots for the Alouettes that are looking a little shaky. and then Justin Chase, a 6'5" tackle from East Carolina, kind of the same thing there. So overall, I think if those two Alberta offensive linemen hit, I think you're looking at a very improved future in terms of offensive line depth for the Alouettes. Now we're going to go on to the other side of the ball and talk about the defense, starting with the defensive line, which is going to come in at 5th in the CFL. And what's interesting about this unit is basically you're reassembling the 2019 Edmonton Elks defensive line that had Sewell, Moore, and Usher on it. And I was joking when free agency was happening that I wanted them to sign Kwaku Boateng and really reunite the entire 4 unit, but they bring in Avery Ellis instead. So we'll start talking about Armando Sewell, who's one of the most consistent snap-to-snap defensive linemen in the league, and he's a future Hall of Famer. Sewell had a down year from a pass rush perspective in 2021, but he still was able to produce 5 sacks. He is still among the hardest players in the league to move in the run game, with that elite play strength that is still very much intact, and that's really what shows up when you watch him today. He's not the most dynamic pass rusher that he once was, but he's just such a hard guy to move and will command double teams on a consistent basis. And then Mike Moore, who comes over from Edmonton and joins his former teammate Sewell on the inside of this defensive line. He's more of a pass rusher from that defensive tackle spot who has a wide array of moves and quickness. While his numbers in Edmonton last year were a far cry from his all-star season in 2019, I definitely think there was a lot of good high-level play in there, and it just didn't show up on the stat sheet. Now paired back up with Sewell, these two guys played so well together in 2019. They complement each other so well in terms of skill set wise. Sewell can command double teams, and Moore can kind of go to work as a pass rusher. I expect this to be a really great tandem again in 2022. And then Nick Usher, another former guy here from Edmonton. He's an edge rusher with high upside, and he has great get off at the snap. Usher is a player that stands out when you watch the Alouettes on defense, and I feel like if he can put all of those physical gifts together on a play-to-play basis, he could be an all-star in this league. However, one thing that has been a concern is his tendency to take undisciplined penalties, often roughing the passer, and that's just stuff that you have to clean up. You can't have that happening on a regular basis, and Usher has struggled with that in his first couple CFL seasons, but the talent is clearly there for him. And then Avery Ellis, a free agent addition coming over from Ottawa. He's a veteran edge rusher who offers a solid floor in terms of production, but isn't a true number 1 pass rusher in my opinion. In Montreal, I think Ellis is going to be asked to play more of a complementary pass rush role with guys like Moore and Usher already here. And I think that's going to really maximize his pass rush effectiveness ultimately, and probably have a pretty good season this year with the Alouettes. And then Michael Wakefield, a returning multi-year CFLer who offers versatility with his ability to slide into any position along the defensive line if need be. He can play a little bit of edge, he can play a little bit of inside. He's not necessarily elite at anything, but I think is a very competent player at every position along the defensive line. He's a great backup or spot starter to have here. And then Vincent Desjardins, who appeared in games with Calgary in a depth role last season. This is a homecoming for him as he attended the University of Laval. And then Andrew Ankra, who made 1 special teams tackle in his only CFL game to date. But overall, I think this is another unit that could outperform my ranking here, just because these guys, a lot of them have played together before and they know what each other does best. And I think that Sewell, Moore, and Usher especially are going to be huge factors for this team this year. Now let's talk about the rookies for this unit on the defensive line, starting with Anthony Luke, who was a member of the team during the offseason in 2020 but didn't make an appearance in a game in 2021. Christopher Favaroso, a 26-year-old defensive end / outside linebacker hybrid. We'll see if he can contribute this year. Brock Gowanlock, a 6'3", 230-pound lineman out of Manitoba that likely features on the edge of the CFL level, if not just on special teams. Deshaun Crawford, who played college football at Southern Mississippi. And then finally, Macario Stanley, a former standout at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, more commonly known as UAB. Overall, not many guys that are super notable out of this group, but we'll see if any of them make an impact. And then looking at their linebackers, which is going to come in at 8th in the CFL, and really the only bright spot here, and the only guy I'm really confident in being a full-time impact starter is Chris Aki, the Canadian here, who's a rangy linebacker / safety hybrid that exceeds in coverage while also being an effective blitzer. He's not the best run defender in the world due to being a little lighter than the average linebacker. However, if I had a vote, Aki would have been my vote for most outstanding Canadian last season. I thought he was that good. He was all over the field. I thought he was this defense's best player, arguably, last season. But then after that, you got a lot of questions about who's going to be starting for this team in this linebacker room this season. So we'll start with Ahmed Thomas, a second-year CFL linebacker who started the majority of the games last season as the Alouettes' middle linebacker. He was often the victim of biting on play action and also had issues in terms of shooting the wrong gap in run defense. However, Thomas possesses great athleticism and speed, which allowed him to show potential in his first CFL season. However, when I was putting together the player list for this video, I realized he was on the team's suspended list, so who knows what's going on with him. And then Jarner Jones, who's a candidate to fill this team's strong side linebacker role next season. He played with the Alouettes in 2019 and saw a good chunk of playing time. He's not a player that really impressed me all too much in those 2019 opportunities, but having that experience should help Jones transition and try to make this roster. Being familiar with the team always helps. And then Tyrese Beverett, who comes over from Hamilton after he played there the past 2 seasons, often in a rotational role in the secondary. He's listed as a linebacker on the Alouettes official roster and is potentially in the mix with Jones to compete for that strong side linebacker job. And then Trey Watson, who may ultimately be this team's starter at middle linebacker if Thomas doesn't show up. He appeared in 8 games and started 1 with Montreal in his first season in the CFL last season. He showed some good flashes in that short playing time, making good open field tackles and getting his hands in passing lanes, which is always good to see for a linebacker. And like I said, I think he is a guy that will factor into that middle linebacking competition. And he may actually have the leg up now that Thomas is not here to start camp, or even if he does show up, Watson may ultimately get the job here at middle linebacker. And then Frederick Chagnong, who's mostly a special teams type linebacker with little to no CFL experience on the defensive side of the ball. Brian Haralamina, a 4th round pick out of Montreal from 2020 that saw some playing time at the linebacker position in his rookie season. And then finally, Richard Clayette, who has had a long pro career after sticking around in the NFL from 2015 to 2019, and then playing in the XFL in 2020 before coming to the CFL in 2021. He only played in 2 games in 2021, split between Montreal and Toronto, so we'll see if he plays a role, if any, this season. So overall, just a lot of questions about this unit. Who's going to start alongside Chris Aki? Obviously don't have questions about him, but who's going to really fill those gaps? That's really what's up in the air about this team in this position. Now, some of these questions may just be answered by these rookies here, starting with linebacker Tyrell Richards out of Syracuse, who was the 1st overall pick in this year's CFL draft. And really impressed as a guy that showed off a lot of versatility, even worked out along the defensive line at the combine and the defensive back room, in addition to what he was able to do at linebacker. Showed off great coverage skills. The one concern with him is he had some, discipline issues in college, ultimately got kicked off of his team at Syracuse, but the athletic talent is obviously there, and he could potentially be a difference-making Canadian player in this league. And then Zach Lindley, another draft pick from this season, who is the 8th round pick for this team out of Western. And then Errol Thompson, who had a stop at the NFL with the Atlanta Falcons, but hasn't really done too much since. And then Jordan Williams, who played his college football with the Baylor Bears. Ultimately, I wouldn't be surprised if one of these guys makes an impact and ultimately ends up starting this year. That's just how it works sometimes in the CFL. And then finally, let's take a look at the defensive back room, which is going to come in at last in the CFL. And somebody had to be, and I think, there's just a lot of inexperience, and I question how all the pieces are going to fit together with this unit ultimately, and, how they're going to perform this year. And we'll start talking about them with Greg Reed, who I think is the best defensive back with this group. He's a physical halfback who is also this team's top cover man. I'm not really sure that Reed played as well in 2021 that he played in 2019, but he still showed a consistent level of play as a leader in this secondary, and will be a type of guy that doesn't shy away from contact, a guy that you'll see a lot and you'll notice when you're watching Alouettes games. Rodney Randall, who had an impressive rookie season from 2021 and played in 11 games and started 7. He's a guy that kind of impressed me last year. I'm looking to see a little bit more from him just on a consistent basis, but I thought the flashes were there. He might start at corner now with Money Hunter leaving in free agency. Mike Jones, a free agent addition from Winnipeg, He is a guy that is one of the best tacklers from the defensive back position in the league and can struggle at times when isolated in coverage. Jones is best utilized playing close to the line of scrimmage with help over the top, so he can take advantage of that physical aspect of his game while minimizing his flaws. And then you have Najee Murray, who's been with the Alouettes since 2018 and has started 15 games in 3 seasons. He has mostly been a corner so far in the CFL, but has also taken some snaps at halfback, so we'll see how he slots into this lineup. I think, again, a likely starter for this team. And then Marc-Antoine Dequoy, a highly touted second-year player who was described coming out of his CFL draft as the best DB prospect to come out of U Sports in years. He was mostly a factor on special teams as a rookie, but he is expected to compete and take hold of that starting safety job in year 2. And then Darius Pickett, a second-year player who had his fair share of struggles last season when pressed into the starting lineup. He also featured as a return man at times, and ultimately I just wasn't all too impressed with him. We'll see if he can improve in 2022. And then Wesley Sutton, another one of these guys that was a rookie last year and started 2 games and didn't really impress in those opportunities despite coming away with an interception. Darius Williams, who played all of last season in Edmonton, where he started some games at corner. And, again, not too impressive, not too noteworthy there. And then Carfella Exum, a high upside special teams player that may never really fit into a true role on defense. We'll see if he ever factors in that way, but regardless, still a high upside special teamer. And then finally, Herb Waters, dressed for 1 game with Edmonton last season, but, didn't really do much else. So ultimately, this unit is very lacking in experience, even though you do have some guys that have played in the league, a lot of guys that are second-year guys that have seen a little bit of action but haven't had a full run as a starter. I just have a lot of questions about how this unit is going to slot in all these guys to the different positions, and ultimately that's why it's going to rank at 9th in the CFL. Now, similar to the linebackers, we'll see if these defensive back rookies play a role, and we'll start with Tyson Otis Copeland, the team's 4th-round pick out of Montreal in this year's CFL draft. Kenneth Durden, a defensive back from Youngstown State, who most notably spent time with Tennessee in the NFL. And then Josh Harvey Clemens, a former 7th-round pick in the NFL draft and played games for Washington. Ethan McConzo, a 6th-round pick in 2021 out of Montreal, who is the brother of Enoch McConzo, who was this year's 4th overall pick in the 1st round out of Coastal Carolina by Edmonton. Gibeon Renfro, a former regular at Texas A&M, who spent time with Seattle in the NFL. Rashad Robinson, who played college football for James Madison. Robert Hayes, a 6-foot, 190-pound corner from SMU. And then Prince Smith, who comes out of New Hampshire, and I don't really see too many football players coming out of New Hampshire. And ultimately, we'll see if any of these guys really help answer any of those questions I have about that defensive back room this year. Now, finally, looking at the final position in our positional rankings with special teams, which is going to come in at 6th in the CFL, and I think this is a really solid unit that had some good kicking and has a really good returner in this unit as well. So David Cote, I thought, was relatively consistent last year. I didn't really have too many expectations going into last year for him. I thought their kicking situation was up in the air, and I think I ranked them pretty low in terms of their overall special teams last year, but Cote definitely performed above my expectations. Zima, again, I didn't do too much punting analysis for these videos, but I thought he looked relatively well from the eye test. And then Mario Elford, who I thought was arguably the most dangerous return man other than Devontae Dedmon in the CFL last season before suffering an injury. So I think it's a really good unit. Unfortunately, only good enough to finish 6th in the CFL here, but I think it's a very acceptable unit at the CFL level. And when you put all of those rankings together, they're going to finish 3rd overall on offense. And I think that offense just looks outstanding on paper. I think that offensive line, that one unit that I have ranked pretty low, has an opportunity to outperform that ranking. I feel confident at quarterback, running back, and receiver as well. And then on defense is where you're going to have questions for this team. It's a very bipolar team in that sense. I think defense is really where this team is going to potentially struggle this year. I think up front on the defensive line, they look really good, but in that back 8, I really don't know how they're going to perform. There's just a lot of questions about who's going to start in certain spots, but we'll see what happens this year. Now, speaking of who is going to be starting at certain spots, let's take a look at the starting lineups, starting with offense. And I think the questions up front on the offensive line start at those tackle positions, where that left tackle job is, I think, a pure competition at a training camp. Schluger is probably going to be the guy that's going to have the inside track to start there, given his previous experience with the team, but you never know, a guy can come into a camp and have a great training camp. And then Landon Rice, I think, is a question to start at right tackle. Do they want to start that extra Canadian at right tackle, or do they want to start someone else in that spot? I think is a question, but I think Rice still likely starts there. Gagnon, I underline him mostly just because of bad moments that he had last year, but overall I think he's a startable player there at that position. And then at the wide receiver position, I think there are a lot of competitions. Obviously not Jake Weineke or Eugene Lewis, but Dante Absher I have penciled into the starting lineup instead of a guy like Quan Bray, but Quan Bray easily could start. I mean, it's a big competition, I think, in that wide receiver room for those depth spots. And then Herjim Ayala I have starting over Keon Julian Grant, who started a lot of games for this team last year. Just a big question, I think, of what Canadian receiver they're going to go with. Could they potentially start 2 Canadian receivers? Maybe the Tyson Philpott factors in there as well, but I think those are the questions you're looking at. Reggie White at slot back as well, a guy that, again, I think is going to start and has a lot of potential, but could potentially get beaten out in training camp. So that's the projected lineup on offense. Now let's take a look at the defense, which I have less questions about in terms of the front 7, but I think the back half of this defense is going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. Obviously, Ahmad Thomas at middle linebacker could be, a complete question mark right now because he's on the suspended list as of right now of this recording. So who knows if he's going to show up and be that starter at middle linebacker. So you could see a guy like Trey Watson, like I mentioned, be that guy there that starts. Tyrese Beverett, I have starting at strong side linebacker, but you could see other guys as well, like Jarner Jones. Going to be a big competition for that spot there. And then I think in terms of the defensive back room, you have questions about whether or not, Najee Murray and Mike Jones, are those guys really going to slot in at those positions? I mean, I think these are probably your 5 starters in the secondary, but I have questions about where exactly they're going to slot in, which ones are going to play corner, which ones are going to play halfback. Murray is an interesting one because he's played mostly corner at the CFL level, and Mike Jones has played mostly corner as well. So I'm going to be really interested to see how this plays out this year for the Alouettes. Now moving towards the team award predictions, and for most outstanding player, I'm going with Vernon Adams Jr. I think he's going to be super motivated this year. Obviously was very upset when Trevor Harris was re-signed. He had a public outburst about that, but I think that he's going to be a super motivated guy this year and make good on his potential. If he could stay healthy, I think he could be a candidate to win most outstanding player of this entire league. And then most outstanding defensive player, I'm going with Greg Reed in that secondary as the best player in that secondary, I think by a pretty wide margin, at least on paper. I just think he's going to have a really good year this year. I think you could go with other guys as well, but I think on the defensive line, I think a lot of those guys could have similar production. So I'm going to go with a guy that's going to really stand out in that secondary unit in Reed. And the most outstanding Canadian, I'm going with Chris Aki, who I believe should have been the most outstanding Canadian in the CFL last season. Ultimately, I think he is the best Canadian on this roster by, I think, a pretty wide margin, in my opinion. And then most outstanding offensive lineman, I'm going with Sean Jamieson, a very quiet but steady starter at center that just does his job on a consistent basis. And then finally, our key question / storyline, and this one is more of a different one that you've seen so far in this series, and I think it's all about discipline and execution for the Alouettes this season. I think on paper, this team has so much continuity in terms of like their offensive pieces, especially quarterback, receiver, running back. Those skill guys have played together for a few years now, and I think those guys have the potential to really elevate this team into being a Grey Cup contender this year. But I think one thing that could hold them back is discipline and execution. In terms of execution, I mean, hitting those, consistent, easy throws over the middle of the field instead of trying to force a throw down the field. And, you have to execute and have a consistent rolling offense. That's a huge thing, and I think also, taking penalties was an issue for this team last year. It was a major problem, and I think if you can clean those things up, this team is going to be right in the thick of things for the top of the East and ultimately the Grey Cup this season. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this roster review, ladies and gentlemen, and be sure to let me know what you think of the Montreal Alouettes going into this season. I think it's a very interesting team that could go towards the bottom of the East. It could be at the top of the East. I think the range of outcomes with this team are very extreme because I think that they have a lot of talent, but they also have some deep flaws on this roster that could ultimately hold them back. So let me know what you think down in the comments section. And with that said, I want to thank everybody for watching. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. We're almost at 500 subscribers, ladies and gentlemen, and I really appreciate if you guys would go ahead and do that. And with that said, I hope everyone has a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.